welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan. This episode, we are recording in the midst of the Israeli-Gaza war. Of course, this also occurs in the midst of the Ukraine war, so we very much are in the midst of World War III, World War Now, as we like to call it here at WWN. But this episode, we're going to be talking about kind of contextualizing some of the stuff going on in the Holy Land with some of the holy sites. Of course, the most recent news involves the bombing of St. Porphyrios Orthodox Church, which is underneath the Jerusalem Patriarchate in the Holy Land. And, there's been, dozens of casualties. Christians have been killed there. And we want to kind of contextualize all of that in the context of the history between the civilizational relationship, I guess, between Christendom and Zionism and proto-Zionism and world Jewry and some of these other entities that are coming more and more into play in this world, especially as here in America and in the West, Christian Zionists and other quote unquote conservatives really try to paint this as a they kind of try to paint this as a civilizational struggle between specifically Islam in the West, with Israel being this outpost of Western values. Especially we've seen people defending, immediately rushing to call the attack on the church a Hamas misfire, all of these sorts of things. So we have a lot of history to talk to you about, whether it comes from Ukraine and the early empire or 1948, when in fact Zionists collaborated with communists, Bolsheviks, terrorists who had killed Christians, killed imperial officials in the Russian Empire, collaborated with them actually to start the Zionist entity. And in many ways that involved the displacement of Christians there at the time. So Dmitry, how are you doing? What are you thinking about this episode? What are we bringing to the table?
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. It's a very pertinent and important episode, I think, to speak about the events in the Holy Land, in the past, as well as how it ties into the present. It should, for those not aware, it should, of course, contextualize some of the primary issues we see today, because I think moving forward in terms of the regular World War Now episode and just the news you will hear, it will be about as explicit as it gets. I think the events in the Holy Land are becoming more and more fiery. But let's just mention just the history, right? Because again, the state of Israel came to be in 1947. Of course, the early 1947, 1948 Israeli war for independence against the Arabs. Now, if you open up a quick map for a context, you look at the United Nations partition of the state of Israel in 1947, you'll notice that most of actually the holy places, including Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, even places like Jericho and some of the monasteries in the desert, actually all fall into the domain of what you would call the early Arab Palestinian states. So in fact, the territory given over to the state of Israel and the Jews, according to the initial plan, was in fact, it would be more or less the coast of the Mediterranean, and the territory is not so much of interest to the Orthodox Christian Church. So from an Orthodox Christian perspective, a lot of our, I guess, if the 1947 plan was to be followed, we would have lived alongside the Palestinians and Arabs a lot more closely than that with the Zionist Jews. Now, what should be said is that, as Conrad mentioned, the early collaboration, the State of Israel, of course, collaborated with the Stalinist communist government in Russia. And Stalin, of course, was a big fan of the State of Israel, especially early on, 1947, 48. And he had the idea of displacing a lot of the old Russian monastics as well as Russian priests who lived in the Holy Land and who had these essentially Russian imperial, you can almost say monarchist, really old school Orthodox ideas. To this day, a lot of the, Russian Orthodox folks in the Holy Land still hold these ideas. This was not at all needed by the Stalinist government. And of course, the Stalinist government was also interested in having an ally in the Middle East. Perhaps this has ties to some of the past Zionist theorists who, were from the Russian Empire and from those Jewish communities, but I think we'll speak about those ties later on. But Stalin nevertheless organized an envoy of essentially future early KGB agents and KVD agents to travel to Jerusalem to take over certain Russian Orthodox property there. The main property, of course, we're speaking about is the really large Orthodox Christian cathedral called the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. It's actually not in the old city of Jerusalem, but it's close to one of the Jerusalem train stations in the New Jerusalem city. This cathedral was built in the 1860s, and I guess the main story which exemplifies the collaboration between the early Israeli state in 1948 and the communist Soviet authorities, right, which allegedly made peace with the Orthodox Church, but we all understand that was, more or less temporary and for political gain in Russia, again, for defeating Hitler and the Third Reich, which it was successful at doing, of course. But what happened in the Holy Land was quite rough. In 1948, the newly victorious Israeli state, its first move against Orthodox Christians in the Holy Land, and despite pressuring the Greek communities there, it decided to take some of this Russian Orthodox property, which the Russians have purchased from the Ottoman Turks and the Arab Palestinians, decades ago, legally and completely for a fair price. And the land wasn't stolen at all. They decided to give all of this property over to the USSR. And so the main cathedral in Jerusalem at the time, the keeper of the keys for this Jerusalem, he was a monk named he was Brother Methodius at the time. He refused to give the keys to some of these KGB agents as well as IDF military men. And this is 1948, by the way. And Father Methodius was beaten very heavily, essentially tortured. He wouldn't give up the location of the keys to the cathedral, and the cathedral had a few miracle working icons too. So Father Methodius refused to give the keys to these people from the USSR as well as the Israeli military law enforcement. He was beaten heavily. His legs ended up taking the brunt of the punishment. His bones were completely broken. His lower legs, from the stories I heard, down from the thighs all the way down, were completely deformed to the point where his feet were completely not even of a shape that he could wear regular shoes into the future. The local nuns and the Orthodox Christians needed to essentially, for their priest and a Kimmendraite, they needed to weave special shoes that would measure up to his deformed legs. So he was completely maimed by these particular people. The keys were stolen from his house. The cathedral came over. Of course, the Soviet authority later transferred it to the Moscow Patriarchate, but the Israeli state collaborated in this, what you would call confessorship. And Father Methodius was later, Father Methodius was also, they threw boiling water over him during the process of torture, so he was greatly maimed and he thrown into a ditch. Father Methodius, frankly, he stayed in the Holy Land for another, I believe, this was 1948, he stayed and he passed away in 1997, so he lived for another, you can say, 50 years in the Holy Land. He was a great confessor and a very pious, even a fool for Christ at one point in his life, a very notable figure, probably a future saint as well, given some of the stories, especially some of the stories my father told me about him. So he was my father's spiritual confessor at the time, and and this is not just the story my dad told me, but some of the other people from the Holy Land who ever met Father Methodius, who would live at the Hebron Monastery of the Oak, or even the Mount Elion, Mount of Olives, Russian Orthodox monastery outside of Jerusalem. Father Methodius, during confession, he would show some of his clairvoyant gifts, and we speak about clairvoyance a lot, but Father Methodius in his late years would essentially read your mind during confession, and he would tell you sins which you may have forgotten, or perhaps sins which you were about to say, they were right on the tip of your tongue, and he would start talking about your sin. So he would essentially exhibit some of these holy gifts given to him by the grace of God. Very pious man, and he passed away in 1997. But his story, Father Methodius, this great holy man, his story essentially exemplifies what it was like to be an Orthodox Christian when the state of Israel came to be, and I'm sure the Greeks experienced the same level of stress as the Russians, where a lot of this property was either given over to the Soviets under pressure, taken off, monks were beaten, priests were beaten, in collaboration with the Israeli state, which the Palestinians never did, in fact. And so it does kind of show that, it was very shaky and stressful. And to this day, the attitude of a lot of the Russian nuns in the Holy Land is, a lot of the Russian nuns, a lot of the Russian monks, and even I would say the Greek, especially now that the Church of Gaza has been bombed, I think a lot of the Orthodox Christians are experiencing this high level of anxiety and stress because the state of Israel is capable of unpredictable things, and now from what we've seen, of atrocities too, of a mass scale. And naturally, the Muslim Palestinians already knew this for personal experience, but this is the Orthodox Christians now very much aware of what this particular Zionist entity is capable of.
That's a fantastic story about Father Methodius, a truly, what an enduring, spiritual father to even remain there after having been treated so poorly by, people who you had already heard of, martyring your friends and ancestors at the beginning of the Soviet Union, only to then, be beaten and abused by those same authorities in collusion with, a literal Jewish authority, the first Jewish authority that would come to power since, since thousands and thousands of years ago at this point. He could say he's literally a confessor of the Judeo-Bolshevik yoke, like in the truest sense of the word, the Zionist Bolshevik yoke, even because again, eventually the Soviet Union viewed Israel as an outpost of United States anti-Soviet, interests, so they kind of turned on the explicit support for Israel as they had at the beginning. But it just goes to show you, and when we're behind the paywall, we're going to really take you back into history, starting back even in the 1820s, and proving the just constant war that this culture, this civilization, this people from which Zionism comes, this Talmudic religion, this group, it breeds this true anti-civilizational, anti-monarchical, anti-Christian attitude that waged war with the Christian empire of the time, Tsarist Russia, until it ultimately collapsed, and then spread its tentacles to the Holy Land. Was able to give itself back. Its the land they feel that they deserve, and then it quickly drove out the Christian vestiges that were there. I talk about this on my appearance on the Stu Peters show this past week. This is being recorded October 20th. The Holy Land was much more Christian before the war Dimitri mentioned, 1947, 1948, before, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians were driven out. So many convents, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, monasteries, churches were destroyed in that war. Both sides would often, station troops in these buildings so that when they were destroyed by the other side, it wasn't as, damaging to the mosques or synagogues, because the churches are less valuable, especially, of course, to the Jews who, the Jews even do view the Muslims more positively than the Christians, because by many interpretations, they actually view the Muslims, since Muslims don't do images and they aren't Trinitarian, they view them as, non-idolaters in their mind. So in many ways, the destruction of churches is viewed as destruction of idols for them explicitly, which is, you hear that you've seen clips of this being talked about on the streets of Israel. But, we're about to get a little more spicy here, so I think we'll see you on the other side of the paywall. But yeah, we're about to go back in time a little bit.
Thank you for listening to the free preview of the 20th Aether Hour episode. To hear the full uncensored discussion of Israel and Palestine, subscribe to our premium Substack. Upon subscribing, you will also receive access to all our previous Aether Hour episodes, as well as our full-length World War Now articles. Your support goes a long way. We really appreciate it. God bless.